Good morning, dear students. We are having a lecture on the subject theory and practice of translation, and today we are going to focus on translation theory, object and objectives. In the framework of our lecture, we are going to look at the following points: translation studies and definition, dialectics of translation, translation invariant, and unit of translation. So let's start our lecture. The second half of the 20th century has seen the in-depth study of translation, which is sometimes called theory of translation, science of translation, translation linguistics, or even translatology. The main concern of translation theory is to determine appropriate translation methods for the widest possible range of texts and to give insight into the translation process, into the relations between thought and language, culture and speech. There are several aspects of this branch of linguistics. First, general theory of translation, whose object is general notions typical of translation from any language. The second, specific theory of translation that deals with the regularities of translation characteristic of particular languages. For example, translation from English into Russian and vice versa. The third, special theory of translation that pays attention to texts of various registers and genres. Translation means both a process and a result, and when defining translation, we are interested in both its aspects. First of all, we are interested in the process because it is a process we are going to define. But at the same time, we need the result of translation, since alongside with the source, the translated text is one of the two sets of observed events we have at our disposal if we intend to describe the process. In order to explain translation, we need to compare the original source text and the resulting target one. However, the formation of the source and target texts is governed by the rules characteristic of the source and target languages. Hence, the systems of the two languages are also included in our sphere of interest. These systems consist of grammar units and rules, morphological and word-building elements and rules, stylistical variations and lexical distribution patterns. Moreover, when describing a language, one should never forget that language itself is a formal model of thinking, that is, of mental concepts we use when thinking. In translation, we deal with two languages, two codes, and to verify the information they give us about the extralinguistic ideas and concepts, we should consider extralinguistic situation and background information. Having considered all this, we shall come to understand that as an object of linguistic study, translation is a complex entity consisting of the following interrelated components. They are elements and structures of the source texts, elements and structures of the target language, transformation rules to transform the elements and structures of the source text into those of the target text, systems of the languages involved in translation, conceptual content and organization of the source text, conceptual content and organization of the target text, interrelation of the conceptual contents of the source and target texts. So, several approaches are used to define translation. So let's look at the first one, semiotic approach. Language system is a part of semiotics dealing with science systems. Therefore, semiotic theories may be applied to language functioning. According to the semiotic approach, translation is language code switching. When translating, we switch from one language to another one. American linguist Roman Jacobson, in his article on linguistic aspects of translation, spoke of three possibilities of code switching. The first one, interlinguistic translation, or rewording, that is interpreting verbal signs through other signs of the same language. This can be done on diachronic level. For example, Chaucer's text is translated into modern English. When done on synchronic level, the kind of code switching is called a paraphrase. We often deal with paraphrasing when trying to explain or define things. For example, to explain the meaning of the phrase "I am not much of a cook," we can paraphrase it by "I do not like to cook" or "I do not cook well." In the theory of translation, this type of code switching is called a transformation. The second one, interlanguage translation, that is substituting verbal signs of one language by verbal signs of another language, or switching from one language code to another one. The type of code switching is translation proper, of course, the object of translation studies. The third one, intersemiotic translation, that is substituting signs of one semiotic system by signs of a different semiotic system. In its broad meaning, the term implies transmutation and can be illustrated by decoding some ideas and themes expressed, for example, in a poem through the language of music and dance. So the next approach is communicative. We communicate to transfer information from one person to another. Translation helps people communicate if they speak different languages. Thus, translation is a two-faceted phenomenon. On the one hand, it is the process of transferring information. On the other hand, it is the result of this process. By the result is meant a new text created in translating. The communicative situation consists of several elements. A speaker, writer, or an author makes a meaningful utterance called the text and addresses it to the listener, reader, or receptor, who understands the purport of the text and reacts to it. The translation situation doubles the elements of communication. The receptor of the original text in turn becomes a translator who makes a translated text or target text intended for the receptor speaking another language. Source text is the text to be translated. The target text is the end product, the translated text. For the translation to be adequate and effective, the target text should be equivalent to the source text. Indeed, when reading tragedies by Shakespeare in Russian, the receptor is but seldom aware that the words he sees in the text were not written by Shakespeare, but some other person, a translator. The form of the target text is new, but the purport and the content are very close to the original. Paradoxically, the better a translator's work, the less his work is observed. The translated text is attributed to the author speaking another language, and this text is used everywhere as if it were the original. Thus, translation unifies two different language speech acts in one communicative situation. It can be defined as a special type of communication intended to convey information between the participants speaking two different languages. So let's talk about dialectics of translation. Inseparability of form and meaning. A translator is to convey not only the ideas and themes of the source text, meaning, sense. He should also pay attention to the adequate form to express these ideas. He should not become carried away with a free form of translation, not for the target language by following the source text word for word. A translator always bears in mind a standard language of the target text. Social functions. Translation does not exist outside of society. It appeared in society when communities began to trade and exchange ideas. At the same time, translation helps the world community develop. Nations could hardly have achieved the technological success as it is in the 20th century if there had been no translations in electronics, physics, chemistry, and other branches of science and technology. Translation and culture are inseparable. Translation could not have developed without culture. Literature, science, and philosophy influenced translators' conceptualizations. On the other hand, culture could not have developed without translation, since translations enrich nations with the cultural values of other nations. Reflection and creativity in translation. Translation reflects the source text, but it does not copy it. To translate adequately, a translator must do his or her best to find a proper means of expression. A translator bears in mind that the receptor has a cultural background, other than that of the receptor of the original text. Therefore, he has to be very resourceful in producing the same impact upon the receptor as that of the source text. Special problems arise in translating dialects, foreign speech, puns, poetry, etc. And a translator is in constant search for new tools to solve translation problems. Translation is an art and a science. Translation is dominated by objective, scientific, and linguistic description and explanation. At the same time, it is a subjective choice of means preserving stylistic equivalence of the source text. So let's speak about translation invariant. By translation invariant, we mean what is in common between the two expressions, a source one and a target one, after our manipulations and transformations of variable phrases. By translation invariant, we should understand the semantic equivalence of the source and the target texts. Some linguists, however, consider the notion to be broader than this definition. They support that it is a real situation described by the text that brings together the source and the target texts. If the situation is understood differently, it leads to misunderstanding, which can happen in monolanguage situations as well, and is often the basis for all sorts of comical jokes. Therefore, the invariant of translation is based not only on semantics, meaning, but also on pragmatics, that is communicative intention. So the last point of our lecture is unit of translation. Singling out and defining unit of translation is a problem widely discussed in translation studies. A unit of translation is the smallest segment of a source language text which can be translated as a whole in isolation from other segments, as small as possible and as large as is necessary. Should we consider a word as a translation unit? Though there exists the notion of a word-for-word translation, the word can hardly be taken for a translation unit. First of all, this is because word borders are not always clear, especially in English. Sometimes a compound word is written in one element. Sometimes it is hyphenated, or the two stems are written separately as a phrase. For example, moonlight, firelight, candlelight. On the other hand, in oral speech, it is difficult to single out separate words because they tend to fuse with each other into inseparable complexes. For example, would you call him? According to the stress, there should be two words, while in written speech we can see four words. Would you call him? Furthermore, it is impossible to consider a phrase word combination as a translation unit because its boundaries are also vague. Thus, it is not a language unit that should be considered in translation, but a discourse or speech unit. A translation unit is a group of words united in speech by their meaning, rhythm and melody. That is, it is a syntagm or rhythmic and notional segment of speech. This definition of the unit of translation is process-oriented. If considered from a product-oriented point of view, it can be defined as a target text unit that can be mapped onto a source text unit. So, my dear students, that's all I wanted to tell you about that, about the object and objectives of theory of translation. Thank you for your attention. Goodbye.